velocity-based training in a high school strength conditioning setting. So first, just as an intro to strength and conditioning is necessary to optimize athletic performance as it enhances strength and speed while minimizing injury risk. It does this by strengthening muscles, of course, but also bone mineral density, as well as strengthening tendons, ligaments, etc. The NSCA states that if a training program is to continue producing higher levels of performance, the intensity of the training must become progressively greater. I think a lot of people, when they first start training, just think that they want to do more weight. And a lot of people just go by the 3x10 volume range, which will get you stronger for a little while, but eventually you have to change the stimulus because your body's going to adapt to that and eventually plateau and stop reaching gains. So eventually you have to change the stimulus up. So some ways to do this is you can increase the weight like we just talked about. You can also increase the number of sessions you do per week or the volume, i.e. sets or reps. You can also decrease rest time to do this. So this graph in the bottom right compares training goal in comparison to repetition. So this is something important to keep in mind when you're prescribing volume. So as you see at the top are the number of repetitions. So you can see that strength and power are primarily targeted in the 6, 5, or less rep range. We start getting into hypertrophy, which is like growing of a muscle, as we get into the 7 through 12 rep range. And after we get past that, we're really just working muscular endurance. So this is important to keep in mind as a coach because you have to know what you're targeting for your athlete. And depending on that, you have to know what volumes to prescribe. So an introduction to percentage-based and velocity-based training. Both these methods allow athletes to improve core lifts through tracking progress and adapting to a stimulus without overtraining. So the key word here is the core lifts. These methods are primarily used in our core lifts, which are bench, deadlift, squat, and Olympic variations, which is clean, jerk, snatch, things of that nature. These are our core lifts or our main lifts because they're complex movements, so they're going to involve lots of our muscles, and we can also load up our lower body the most with these variations. So percentage-based training specifically involves prescribing volume based on a 1 repetition maximum. So for this method, we'd have a test day to where we'd see how much weight our athlete could do for 1 rep, and from here, in the weeks following, we would prescribe volume based on this weight that he did. So we take a percentage of that number to prescribe volume from there. Velocity-based training is a recently emerging method which prescribes volume and load based on the speed in which the bar moves. So instead of just worrying about how much weight on the bar, it's actually going to take into account how fast that bar is moving. So for velocity-based training, it uses a few different things. It uses an accelerometer, a linear position transducer, an inertial measurement unit, or camera-based systems to track velocity. So this top right picture here, that's an E-node sensor. And this one's an example of the inertial measurement unit. Its primary sensor is an accelerometer, and the accelerometer is going to track velocity in a vertical plane. And it also includes a gyroscope, which is going to measure angular velocity. So not only can it measure the speed of the bar, but it can also measure your technique. And you can kind of see how that bar path is, and you can adjust technique from there. The bottom picture is an example of the linear position transducer. So this one measures velocity based on how fast that tether is pulled. So that cord is actually connected to the bar, and again, based on how fast that thing's pulled, it's going to track velocity from there. Both these methods are going to give you an instant feedback to an iPad or a phone, or on the linear position transducer on the box itself. It's going to give you a number right away, so you know immediately from rep to rep how fast that bar is moving. So our research purpose was to assess high school strength conditioning coaches for familiarity and experience in using or not using velocity-based training. So this first literature review article did a really good job of kind of explaining why even use velocity-based training, and if so, how to implement it into a team setting. So first of all, why even track velocity? Well, I think, like I stated earlier, that a lot of people are just worried about how much weight's on the bar. And kind of the name of the game in sports is how much force can we produce and how fast can we produce force. So if we go back to the simple force equation, it's simply mass times acceleration. So not only can we just increase weight on the bar to increase our force or strength, we can also keep the same weight and move that bar a little bit faster. That's also going to give us greater force production. So why velocity-based training specifically? Like I kind of mentioned earlier, it gives us instant feedback. So that instant feedback, that number that you see right away, can enhance our motivation and competitiveness. Not only competitiveness within my athletes, but also within yourself, because you have that instant feedback. You know exactly what number you hit right there. It's also more individualized and auto-regulatory than other methods. So percentage-based, you prescribe a certain number of reps in sets and load, and you're just going to do that for the whole time, whereas velocity-based training, you can actually change your load or your sets and reps during the set to adapt to how the athlete may be feeling in that certain situation or that day. So load velocity profile is just a way to individualize the training. So this is going to be separate from athlete to athlete. You can get around using velocity-based training without using the load velocity profile, just by using averages from articles on the web, for example. But again, this is just going to individualize your training even more. So to do this, you would complete 3 repetitions. After completing a warm-up, of course, you would do 3 reps at 20, 40, and 60% of the athlete's projected 1 rep max. Since we're doing 3 reps, we would take the fastest velocity from those 3. You'd then complete 1 rep at 80 and 90%, and then this article allows 5 maximal attempts at a 1 rep max. In my opinion, that's kind of a lot of 1 rep max attempts to allow, but poses some injury risk potentially, but that's what this article went for. So anyway, from those numbers, you would then plot the mean velocity straight across from the percent of 1 rep max. You do this in Excel, and from there, you create a graph with that. You, again, plot those numbers on the graph, apply a linear line regression, and that's just going to give you the numbers so you know kind of where that baseline is for that athlete to where he should be, how fast he should be moving the bar at a certain percentage or a certain weight for that day. So there's a few different methods that you can use velocity-based training for. The first one's the most popular. This one's set average velocity. So this one, after each set, the average velocity must be within 0.06 meters per second of that baseline that we got from the load velocity profile. So if it's not, if I'm feeling really fatigued one day and I'm moving the bar a little slower than I did on test day, then I'll actually put the weight down, and then I'll be able to move that weight faster. So I'm actually going to decrease weight on the bar. Instead of just doing the same weight, moving it slower, I'll decrease that weight on the bar to still get that same force production that we're looking for. The next one is set average velocity plus the velocity loss threshold. These next 3 use a velocity loss threshold. What that means is that you're going to prescribe a certain percentage of velocity that you can go down from that first rep. So if my first rep, for example, is 1 meter per second, and I prescribe a 20% velocity loss threshold, as soon as I hit 0.8 meters per second, I'll terminate the set, and I'm done with the set. So this next one is similar to the last, except that our reps are flexible. So after the set, the average velocity must be within that zone, and if it's not met, then the load is manipulated. So similar to that last one, except that our reps aren't fixed, I'm just going to do as many reps as I can until I hit that velocity loss threshold. The next one's a fixed set plus the velocity loss threshold. So this one, the load's fixed, so I'm not going to adjust the weight at all. This time I'm just going to reach that velocity loss threshold for a certain amount of sets, and I'll terminate the set after that. This last one, I think this last one's a little better to the prior one I talked about. It's very similar, except that instead of prescribing sets, I'm prescribing reps. So I'm going to prescribe 20 sets, say, and I have as many sets as I need to hit those 20 reps. I like this one better because for sets, my athlete can do 5 reps, or he can do 20 reps, and these two things are going to elicit different adaptations. And that's kind of, as a coach, you have to know what adaptations you're targeting based on time of year and things of that nature. So reps, I think, is the ideal method compared to that one, because you know how many reps you're prescribing, what you're trying to adapt in your athlete, and you know he's going to hit that rep number. So these next couple articles, they both compared velocity-based training and percentage-based training. So this first one used back squats, and they used 15 strength-trained males. And they found that the velocity-based training group elicited significantly faster mean and peak velocities, while the percentage-based group sustained more time under tension and reps. I think the key word here is time under tension. What this means is basically how long I'm underneath the bar. So with greater time under tension, I'm going to be more sore for one, but I'm also going to tap into more hypertrophy the longer time under tension I have. It's also good for my tendons and ligaments, but this is important to keep in mind because the more time under tension I have and the more sore I am, then depending again on the time of the year. If I'm in season, I don't want to be super sore. If I'm out of season, maybe I do to hit those hypertrophy gains. So something important to keep in mind there. They concluded that velocity-based training permits faster velocity, avoids unnecessary mechanical stress, but maintains similar measures of force and power output compared to strength-oriented VBT. This next study used rugby players to compare the two. They found the velocity-based training group experienced greater velocity and power outputs, while time under tension and perceptual training stress were lower. So very similar to the previous article. They concluded that velocity-based training can be implemented during the competitive season instead of percentage-based training to improve training stimuli, decrease training stress, and promote velocity-specific adaptations. I think this is a really good point because, again, velocity-based training can be used in season to kind of decrease that stress. We're already getting a lot of training stimuli from our sport itself. So this is a good way to kind of decrease the stress on the body while still hitting the same power outputs and the same force productions as I would with heavier weight. So this last study here compared the two, and they specifically focused on how it affected strength, counter movement jump test, which is just a vertical jump, and sprint performance. So this study used 24 resistance trained males, and they completed back squats for 3 weeks for 6 weeks, 3 times a week for 6 weeks, excuse me. And both methods were used in an undulating format. So this just means that from one day to the next, I'm going to go from high intensity to low intensity back to high intensity. So instead of just progressively getting heavier or more intense from one session to the next, I'm actually going to go back and forth. This is kind of an ideal method for the more advanced athletes you have. So this study concluded that both methods improved 1 rep max and change direction times. However, percentage-based might be slightly more favorable for athletes focusing on maximum strength, while velocity-based training is more beneficial for counter movement jump, sprint, and change of direction improvements. So our survey, what we really wanted to find from the survey was, if at all, how are high school strength conditioning programs in Nebraska using velocity-based training, and what are the benefits and limitations of it in their real-world setting. So our participants were required to be responsible for delivering their strength conditioning program within their school. The school had to be located in Nebraska. They had to be 19 years of age. I hope they are if they're teaching. And they had to agree to our consent form. So as far as our methods and data collection went, we had to complete our IRB process and create a Microsoft form survey from there. How our survey worked was we first had a demographic section to where we assessed how long these coaches had been in the game, how long they'd been teaching one, how long they'd been strength and conditioning for two, and kind of other demographic questions like that. From there, we asked if they used velocity-based training or not. If they did, they were taken to a survey that asked how they implemented, what were the benefits and limitations that they found within their settings from it. And if not, they were directed to a different part of the survey to where we asked why not, is it funding, or what other reasons do you have for not using it, are you not educated with it, things of that nature, and kind of what other methods do you use in resistance training for your athletes. So from here, we had to obtain permission from the administration to distribute the survey to coaches. This kind of created I think we could have got more responses if we didn't have to go through the administration, but we did. We had to send emails out to a superintendent or a principal first to get permission to send the survey to their strength conditioning coach. We sent it to every Class A and B school in Nebraska, as well as most of the small schools around here. So we sent over 200 emails, and we got 14 responses from that. So from there, we distributed the survey if the administration didn't do so already for us. And then from there, since it's a qualitative survey, and we didn't have necessarily black and white answers from everybody, we just had to find similar keywords and themes between the different responses. So results from the demographic. So again, all the coaches completed this section. All of them work with high schoolers, while 8 trained middle schoolers as well. I think this is a good point because it's good that over half of them train their middle schoolers too, because that's just setting up a good foundation for when they get into high school. So that was good to see. 14 of them had a bachelor's degree. Their primary area of specialization was 10 of them had a PE major, 2 of them were primary strength conditioning or exercise science major, while 1 had a social studies and 1 had an admin primary area of specialization. Half of the subjects had no strength conditioning certification at all. So this was a little alarming to us, as of course this creates safety and liability issues within the strength conditioning realm. as well as it doesn't quite allow your athlete to be the best athlete he can be if the coach necessarily isn't primarily specialized in strength and conditioning. So this bottom chart here to the bottom right, that just tells us what the certifications were. That longest bar on the bottom is the none category, unfortunately. However, the second longest one with 5 is the NSCA CSCS certification. That was good to see because this is kind of known as the gold standard of strength conditioning certification. So most of them had this certification, and multiple coaches also had multiple certifications as well that are listed up there. So results for our VBT implementation group. So 4 out of the 14 coaches used VBT. I thought it was really interesting that 3 of them used devices while 1 of them just relied on his sight and judgment. So volume prescription, 2 of them used primarily percentage-based, and 2 used a combination of both methods. Again, kind of like we talked about earlier, mostly were used with bench squat, deadlift, and Olympic-style variations or core lifts, but 1 of them used it for plyometrics as well. So that's interesting. There is a way you can actually attach these trackers to your body and track how fast, how high you jump, how fast you're moving, how fast you're cycling when you're running, things of that nature. So there is more uses for it outside of just simply tracking how fast that barbell is moving. So methods implemented, 4 of them implemented velocity zones. So that's kind of what we talked about. You prescribe, okay, you have to be above 0.7 meters per second, and then the athlete can go from there. None of them prescribed the velocity loss thresholds like we talked about. This was interesting, but I don't think it's too surprising because I think the velocity loss thresholds is a lot harder to implement in a team setting to where you have to tell your athlete, okay, as soon as you reach 20% less than your first rep, stop the set. That's hard to do in the middle of a set and in the middle of a lift, whereas you can just tell them to go above 0.1, for example, and that's a lot easier to track for high school kids especially. Some of the specific benefits that they listed is that instant feedback that it gets you, the auto-regulatory and individualizedness of it, and one coach said it also creates buy-in through competitiveness. Some limitations that they listed are connectivity, calibration issues. Of course, it's technology, so that's always not fun to deal with sometimes. And also the high cost. They're not cheap, especially if you have multiple racks in your weight room. You need the device and you need the technology device to send that information to. So combining those 2 things at each rack can get pretty pricey. One coach said that we are adamant with our students that they must have a strength base prior to worrying about VBT. We're using it as an incentive to reach a sufficient level of strength, and then they're gaining access to our VBT program. I like this because, again, it gives another incentive to work hard in the weight room and to kind of earn your spot to use velocity-based training. And we'll talk more about it later, but it's also important to have a strength base before even using velocity-based training. So the rest of the 10 subjects didn't use VBT at all. Half of them had looked into adding it to their program, however. Their primary reasons for not using it, the number 1 reason was not having the proper funding or cost. So yes, these devices are expensive. However, I do think there is a gap in funding in strength conditioning programs in general around the state. And 4 of them were not educated or familiar with it at all. One coach mentioned that most high schools have large gaps in equipment quality and quantity that should be addressed before the purchase and introduction of velocity-based training systems. Until VBT becomes more cost-effective, they're not reasonable pieces of equipment to purchase and maintain. I thought this was a good point because you really should get things that are going to benefit your weight room for the most kids versus just velocity-based training systems that might affect half of your kids and your more advanced athletes. So I thought this was a good point and kind of points out that there isn't proper funding in our strength conditioning settings. In a lot of these high school weight rooms, we don't even have the proper equipment, let alone the talk about velocity-based training is kind of an afterthought. So for our discussion, as far as the demographic went, there are large disparities exist in high school weight rooms, such as the lack of funding and coach and education certification status. So one of our studies supported this claim and said that only 9.4% of strength conditioning faculty supervisors held the CSCS certification, 27.8% lacked a certification at all, and 63% did not have a dedicated strength coach overseeing the strength conditioning facility. That's a crazy number right there. I think it's a lot to put on a PE teacher's plate to have to run classes, make programs for strength conditioning classes and sports, and on top of that, maybe even coaching sports too. So that's a lot to ask of them, and the program is going to reflect that, and it may not be as thought out as it could be. And our last point here is that it's common for educators without certifications to oversee high school weight rooms, which again presents great safety and liability issues. Even at small commercial gyms, you have to have a certification of some sort to train clients, even if it's one-on-one. So I don't see any reason that a strength conditioning coach should be able to run a strength conditioning class without having the proper credentials. So results for percentage-based training is that percentage-based training is best for beginners. At this point, the focus of the training is to become more proficient for movement patterns and to increase muscle size and capacity. This naturally results in strength gains and increased velocities, so VBT isn't necessary yet. So just as an athlete, a beginner athlete comes into the weight room, even if he comes in 1 time a week, that's more than he's done before. So he's naturally going to get stronger through that. And also, the velocity is going to keep going up from that too, just because he's getting stronger. So it's not necessary. Velocity-based training isn't necessary for beginners. It could add an element potentially, but again, it's not necessary. Both mean and concentric time under tension are significantly longer during percentage-based compared to velocity-based. Just like we talked about earlier, the more the more time under tension that we have, the more we're targeting muscle size and capacity, which is again what we're looking for in beginners. Also, the more time we're under that bar, the more proficient we're going to become in our movement patterns, just because we have more time to feel out that movement. So percentage-based training should be implemented when maximum strength is the goal. So this study discovered that percentage-based training is a better option when the athlete's focusing on maximum strength, trying to get that 1 rep max number up. I agree with this to a certain extent. When an athlete gets super advanced and he's really just been pushing weight for a long time, then I think velocity-based training can be good to take a little stress off of his body and just focus on how fast that bar is moving, which again is going to result in more force production anyway. So for our discussion with velocity-based training, we concluded that it's ideal for power training and plyometric improvements. Velocity-based training improves change of direction, sprint, weighted counter movement, jump, more so than percentage-based training, that study found. And velocity-based training is especially useful during the season. Velocity-based training provides a change in training stimulus, decreased physical stress, and promotes velocity-specific adaptations, while it also elicits similar force and power outputs compared to percentage-based training, while avoiding unnecessary mechanical stress, and it allows for faster velocities. So just like I talked about earlier, I think it is the ideal method for in-season training because from set to set, if I'm feeling really bad, if I played a lot in a game and I'm very fatigued that day, velocity-based training is going to recognize that, and therefore my volume is going to decrease to where maybe we had a quick game where I'm not very fatigued from the game and I'm feeling really good. I can still improve my strength and my power during season because again, I can add weight or I can add reps because velocity-based training is going to notice that I'm feeling really good that day. Our last discussion point on velocity-based training is that if funding and equipment is an issue, it can be loosely implemented through coach's perception. So this coach is the one who didn't use any devices at all, and he stated that we don't have any devices to measure the bar speed, but he'll program an exercise to be performed up as fast as possible, for example, and he'll watch and monitor the bar speed for the prescribed exercise. He will coach and reinforce adequate bar speed for that given exercise using his own judgment. So I explained undulated format earlier to where you have a heavy day and then a light day, heavy day, light day. I think this can be a really good way to implement that. And on that dynamic or that light day, you know as a coach how fast that bar should be moving. So if I'm watching a kid, I think he's getting too heavy and that bar's not moving very fast, I can tell him to take a little bit of weight off to where if the bar's moving super fast and I think he can add a little bit of weight, then I can tell him that. And that's a way to implement the velocity-based training principles without necessarily needing all the money to do so. So some limitations of our study. We did have a small number of participants and only 14 of them. We had a relatively short time frame to collect the survey. I should have got on my IRB a little sooner, so we only had about a month to collect it, and it ended up being a lengthy process, so that was a limitation there. Our subjects were limited to just Nebraska high schools. We had to go through administration before sending the survey out to coaches, which again just added another layer to where I think we could have got more responses without doing that. And all studies that we referenced use strength trained males. None of them use females or untrained individuals. So this was a big limitation in my opinion, because most athletes in high school setting are going to be untrained for one, and of course there's male and females in there. So that was a big limitation, and unfortunate that we didn't catch that earlier. So our conclusions that we found is that there's an education and funding gap in the high school strength conditioning setting that really should be addressed. We've also found that percentage-based training is the ideal method for targeting hypertrophy and max strength adaptations, while velocity-based training is a great tool that's especially useful for advanced and in-season athletes. In conclusion, the percentage-based and velocity-based training should both be strategically implemented at different phases of the year to elicit desired adaptations that best fit the athlete's needs and meet the athlete where they're at. And that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions?
Dex, what do you think the biggest, you mentioned going to the administrators, why do you think that was your biggest obstacle to getting responses? Or do you think it was because they weren't communicating that down to the coaches? Or
right, and I honestly didn't get a lot of responses from most of the administrators. A lot of them didn't even get back to me at all. Whereas if I just directly sent it, well, first of all, I have better relationships with strength and conditioning coaches around Nebraska. I'm involved in the Nebraska Strength and Conditioning Coaches Association, and I know their directors and their board members pretty well, and I thought that could be a good way to have them send out my survey for me, in which they have a wide base of Nebraska high school strength and conditioning coaches all over. And again, just the relationships that I have with some strength and conditioning coaches, if it came directly from me, I think I would have had better results to where I had to go through administration. I don't even think they got to that point a lot of the time, so where administration kind of just saw my email and brushed it off. And again, I only got responses from about 15 of them. 14 actually completed the survey, but I got responses from a little bit more than that. But I think if I could have gone directly to the coaches themselves, then I could have got some more responses.
now, did you go that route just simply because that's what you put in your IRB and that's what you had to follow?
No, we did not put that in our IRB. The board made us do that. I think the reason being was so we're not bypassing the administration. I don't know, I didn't really agree with it. I don't think they wanted the survey to be, the link to be sent to the coaches for some reason before the administration saw them, and to maybe someone who wasn't qualified to do the survey, when in reality that just added an extra step and we had to send out more emails through that. So
Going straight through the schools probably wasn't a terrible idea, because if you would have went through the state Strength and Conditioning Association, you would have gotten just coaches that were probably certified, and it would have probably skewed your results in a more positive, you know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't have got the full picture
I see what you're saying.
of how many unqualified coaches there actually are in the state.
Right.
So,
and we did kind of have to change our study based on the results we got. We weren't originally necessarily focusing on the qualification status and things of that nature. We were more focused on how VBT was being implemented in the real world setting. So based on the results that we got from that, and that 10 of them didn't even use it at all, then we had to focus more on the demographic than the velocity-based training itself. So I think the results that we got even changed up the study a little bit in itself. But
I would encourage you to maybe try and do this again, or maybe have Paul or somebody follow this up, and maybe with a little bit different methodology. Maybe just get permission from the administrators to conduct the study first. I don't know if that would be a route you can go, and then send it directly to the coaches. That way the administrators are aware that the study is happening, but they're not necessarily the middleman between getting your responses.
Yeah, for
I'm
sure.
wondering if you could just have it, get permission from IRB to send it simultaneously to both.
True,
The administrator and the coach, so the administrator's aware, but the coach is getting it right away, and we're not making them a middleman.
And did you follow up with how many times did you kind of blast the email to them?
Only twice.
Okay.
So yeah, I could have done that more. I figured if I sent it twice, they'd seen it and they probably just decided to not follow up with me, so I didn't want to just be that annoying guy who kept sending it out, but.
The IRB process took a little longer than we anticipated. Just,
Yeah, we went back
you know,
and
being a
forth for a
survey,
while.
we didn't think it would take too long, but that snag held us up a little bit.
I think this is a really, really important topic that you really opened some eyes to. I took a picture of your one percentages, because I don't think people are, and I know this isn't really your topic, but I don't think people are even close to aware
Right,
who is administering our strength programs at the high school level.
for sure.
Even, not even from a performance standpoint, but maybe so much even from a safety standpoint.
Yeah, right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and can I interrupt your
Go ahead,
question? Because I
sorry.
have some questions. First of all, excellent job, and the reason that you chose Paul is because this is completely out of my wheelhouse.
Yeah.
But, so my question is, you know, you focus a lot on the well, first, of the 15 or the 14 that responded, were they more urban or metro?
That's a great question. So it was an anonymous survey, so we weren't sure where they were
So-
from. So yeah,
So you
since it
didn't
was
have any
anonymous, we
demographics.
didn't know where they were from.
And so the second one then is you focus a lot on the value of velocity-based training for performance.
Right.
And, you know, and I know that then, you know, limits the types of sport, because endurance is not what we're working on here.
Yeah.
We're working on power and
Right.
force. So performance-wise, but I'm looking at injury prevention also.
No.
Is there any literature that says that people that do BBT are less likely to have performance-related injuries? And, or what do you think about that?
I do think so. So talking about the velocity loss thresholds, I focus more on kind of the shorter ones, 20% for example, but the longer velocity loss threshold that you had, the more similar it was to PBT, and that, of course, the more time under tension you were going to have to. In an injury prevention, of course, the longer that is, it's better for your tendons, ligaments, and injury prevention in that way. So yes, the longer velocity loss threshold, I think that's the best way that you could implement BBT for injury prevention and
In the sport, not in the training. That's what I mean, it's in the sport.
like during sport performance.
Right, right.
Oh, so like tracking how fast I'm
Right.
moving while I'm playing my sport.
Well, no. People that do the BBT,
Yep.
and they're in football, in rugby, in power jumps, and that type of things, and those types of sports, there are obviously contact sports and other things like that,
Oh,
so, injuries, so let's not worry about those. But other overuse injuries type of things that you might have in those, you know, movement sports. I'm just wondering if it can reduce those kinds of overuse injuries that you might see in those kinds of sports.
Okay, through training still though?
Yes, by the training, yes. So
Okay.
those athletes, so maybe even looking at those that do BBT training and how long they've been doing it, and then what is the incidence of performance-related injuries in their
Okay.
sport?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just another way to, I don't know if this is answering your question, but it's just another way to change the stimulus and elicit different responses. So, I mean, and just through strength training and training in general, that's gonna decrease our injury risk in itself.
Right.
So it's a great way to, again, how it just changes that stimulus and maybe targets a little bit different adaptation. I think just through that yeah, it definitely is a great way to mitigate injury.
Yeah, actually theoretically, so I'm just
Right.
curious.